All right. Well, welcome to the July meeting for the Rural HPV Vaccination Learning Community. On behalf of the American Cancer Society and the National HPV Vaccination Roundtable, I want to thank you all for taking time to be a part of today's session, whether that's live currently or via recording in the future. Today's meeting will be our second session of our summer series on quality improvement. Today will be focused on process mapping and gap analysis. If you want to go ahead to the next slide. Oh, if you can go back one. All right, so I'm Ashley Locke, HPV Program Manager for Geographic Disparities at the American Cancer Society, and I have the honor of kicking off today's session, but I'm just part of a larger team that encompasses many colleagues from both the American Cancer Society and the National HPV Vaccination Roundtable who work on increasing HPV vaccinations every day. You'll hear from a few of them today. If you want to go to the next slide. So to get us started, I'd like to share just a few reminders with you. So today's call will be recorded, and the video and slides will be shared afterwards via email and also be posted on our public-facing website. Because the session is being recorded, if you don't wish to have your image recorded, please stay off video. We have provided visual directions on how to do so. We're asking all participants to make sure they rename themselves and include their first and last name for attendance purposes. There are two options to rename yourself, and we've provided written directions on the screen. Because we have an extremely full agenda and we want to have plenty of time for sharing, we are going to rely heavily on the chat box for questions throughout the call. As you have questions or comments, please add them to the chat and we'll answer them throughout today's session. During our panel, we will invite you to raise your hand and come off mute to ask questions to our panelists. In order to come off mute, you can use the microphone button at the left of your screen to turn your mic on and off. And lastly, if you have Zoom questions, we have that chat box open and we're all here to support you, but feel free to ping myself, Christina, Gabby, or Kayla if you need assistance, and we're available to help you. If you go to the next slide. As far as our roadmap for today's call, in just a few minutes, we will kick off today's session and hear from Andrew Anderson from American Cancer Society. We'll be talking about process mapping and gap analysis, followed by a panel of partners who will talk about their experience around these topics. And then as we wrap up, I will showcase our website and explore some tools to support you with process mapping and gap analysis. Next slide. And as we've shared before, both the American Cancer Society and the National HPV Vaccination Roundtable take a systematic approach to our quality improvement framework. This slide in particular showcases the steps we and our partners use to not only improve HPV vaccination rates, but also cancer screenings. Today, we will begin by exploring processes and gaps to identify and customize evidence-based interventions. During our August session in just a few weeks, we'll actually deep dive into those different buckets of evidence-based interventions. Next slide. So before I introduce Andrea, I do want Kayla, if she could pull up a quick poll. We are just going to see where everyone's sort of at when it comes to process mapping and gap analysis. So feel free to share how familiar you are with process mapping, how familiar you are with gap analysis, and what programs and tools you use to do both. All right, looks like we've got 20% participate so far. Close to that 50%. Hoping to get to 80% today. Feel free, if you haven't taken the poll, to do so. Give it a couple more seconds. right, Kayla, why don't you go ahead and stop the poll and share the results? So it looks like 38% of you are not familiar at all with process mapping, 25% are slightly familiar, 14 are somewhat familiar, 17 are moderately familiar, and 5% are extremely familiar. So it seems like a majority are going to hopefully learn quite a bit today in process mapping. And then similar, 29% are not familiar with gap analysis, 29% are slightly familiar, 21% somewhat, 16 are moderately familiar, and 5% are extremely familiar. So thank you all for participating in the poll. I appreciate it. And so we can go to the next slide. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our didactic presenter for today's session. Andrea Anderson is an Associate Director of Quality Improvement with nearly 23 years at the American Cancer Society. For the majority of her tenure, she's focused on patient support initiatives, collaborating directly with health systems to enhance cancer screening and survivorship programs. She's trained in Lean Six Sigma. Her current responsibilities as a quality improvement consultant and coach include implementing effective strategies that lead to tangible improvements in cancer care delivery for safety net and rural health systems serving the most vulnerable patient populations. Andrea's ongoing mission is to improve cancer care outcomes for all patients and their families, regardless of socioeconomic status, geographical location, or personal background and identity. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Communication and a Business Management from Ohio University. Andrea, take it over.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks for having me today to talk about process mapping and root cause analysis. These are actually two of my favorite topics when it comes to quality improvement. But I will share that of all of our QI work, they tend to see the most resistance from, the systems we work with. And I'm not sure if that's just because a lot of people consider them to be tedious or time consuming or, just have nervousness around facilitating the process mapping process. But I'm here to share with you today a little bit of information on process mapping and root cause analysis and show you how easy it can actually be. So when we talk about process mapping, it's essentially a diagram that acts as a blueprint for understanding the entire process, helping us to define each step clearly and analyzing the effectiveness. By mapping out the process, we can easily spot where deviations occur from the standard procedure, allowing us to address inconsistencies and improve reliability. It also highlights the interconnections between the various steps in the departments and promotes better understanding and collaboration across teams. And for most of us, we use it to uncover redundant tasks and gaps, pain points, or areas of instability, enabling us to streamline operations and enhance efficiency. But in the end, it's a great comprehensive guide that can be used to train and onboard new staff and or use with current staff to just ensure everyone stays on the standard process and uses that process moving forward. Next slide. So there are a few elements of a good process map. We know that, depending on your experience in quality improvement, or if you have anyone on your team who's very experienced in quality improvement, they will tend to be very much wanting to follow the rules. So process maps generally flow from top to bottom and left to right. They identify who is responsible for each task. They use arrows to show the flow and order of the processes and tasks, and they use symbols to identify steps and decisions. I have worked with a number of health systems that, I've seen the process map. snakes around and curves around, and it's hard to follow. As long as I can follow the process, I'm generally okay with it, but you will run into individuals that really want to follow the rules when it comes to process mapping. There are a few things that you definitely want to include, and when it comes to the symbols used, they're pretty consistent across the board. So the terminator is where the process begins and ends. So you will use that symbol for that. And then anytime there is a decision point where, you could go one of two or three directions, you'll use a diamond shape. And so if a patient were to come for their appointment, yes, they arrived, you would go and follow that direction. If they no-showed, then you would follow a different direction. The process is generally symbolized by a square, and that's what each step of the process will be using. And then the arrow to sort of signify the direction of the flow. And then input output really, is used for any type of data entry or reporting. And then if there's a process within the process, you see the symbol that we use for that. Next slide. So how to process map? It's really simple. You can almost do it in any situation with technology these days. When I first started, I would meet in person almost every time, and we would throw up those large post-it notepads on the walls, and then we would use the little sticky notes as each step. But these days, since COVID, I've mostly done all of my process mapping virtually. And it's pretty easy to do once you get the hang of it. There's quite a few different programs that help you to process map. But even if you don't want to pay for those programs, you can use PowerPoint. I have used whiteboards before. They're not as easy to use, but at least you can get the steps down, and then you can go on to create a fancier process map in the end. But the first step is to identify the process that you want to focus on. And so, is that going to be the process from when a patient arrives for their first HPV vaccination? Is it something else? But then you also want to define the scope. And so when you look at, say, an HPV process map, do you want to include everything leading up to the patient arriving for their appointment, such as the reminder calls and the text messages or whatever that's used to remind patients of their appointment? And where do you want to end the second the patient leaves their appointment, or the second that they receive their follow-up reminder for their second dosage? So you really have to define what you're wanting to process map, and what the beginning is and the end is of your process. Then you want it to gather information and inputs. So for most of you, hopefully, fingers crossed, you have the ability to pull together, the right team, the people who are really involved in the process, who can provide all of the steps and information you need to put a thorough process map together. But that's not always the case. So sometimes you have to do a little bit of information gathering. If your front desk can't make it to the meeting, you may have to do or have a conversation with them to collect some information about what they do as part of the process. But you want to get all of that information prior to bringing everyone else together to complete your process mapping. And then, like I said, it's just a matter of getting it put on either paper, or if you're using a program, getting it down. I do recommend that if you do it in person and you go the post-it note route, that you definitely use the large pieces of paper. We've even used paper off of like the patient beds before and just taped it up to the wall. But you need to have something that you can then carry away and use when you're really putting it down in a nice format to move forward. You need to give everyone sort of an overview of what you're trying to accomplish. Letting each person have sort of their own say in the, mapping the workflow. Using the symbols and visual aids will help keep everyone on track. Generally, we give each role or department their own color. So all of the RNs are pink and all of the MAs are green, and you can really follow the process in that way. But we also use, like I said, um, a lot of different programs. I use Visio, which is very straightforward, very easy to use, but it does have a cost. There's also Lucidachart, but there's a program called Draw. It's like Draw period IO. They did or used to have a free version, which was really easy to use for process mapping. If you wanted to do something virtually, we have everyone call in and kind of do it over a conference call. I've also completed process mapping using PowerPoint. And really to each their own. For some people, that's easy. That's just the way they've done it. And they continue to use PowerPoint. For me, it's a little more difficult to get everything looking nice. So I generally try to use something else. And then once you have it down and you've sort of worked as a team to get it refined, you want to then make up your pretty version and use that to sort of share with your MDs, your medical director, kind of get their input, make any tweaks and adjustments, and then you have your final product. Next slide. So here you see a sample process map, and I asked Ashley to send me one that used an HPV workflow for appointments. And so really just want to kind of get your feedback at this point. You can use the chat feature to share what you see when you look at this process map. What do you like? What's missing? Um, what is it that you think could improve?
Um, I think an improvement could be I don't see a title, and I don't know if that's just because this is a sample, but
Yeah.
a title to say like what the goal of this process is.
Yes, exactly. That's a great point. I see patients less than 9 years old. It's not clear who's doing what. Colors would be nice as well. Exactly. So it lists out some of the steps the providers take, but who's pulling that schedule and who's sending the email to the providers, that's unclear. So someone who's following this workflow would not know that if they weren't part of creating it. Swim lanes are nice for different areas, yes. So we'll show another version of process mapping here in a minute that kind of divides it out by department. I need color. I do too. I always use color when creating my process maps. Time and place for the different phases of the
What
process.
about the font in this map for me is difficult to read with the font all different and in and out of the
Yes,
squares and the triangles and
exactly. Thank you for sharing that. I was looking at it and it talks about provider gives a strong recommendation and then checkout. So who's actually providing the vaccine? Um, there's a few steps missing. So as you can see, process maps, when you're looking at it from a bird's eye view, can really be helpful in identifying some gaps. Likely, that's not a gap, but once you got it down to this phase, it would be easy to see what's missing from your workflow and improve from there. There are a few things that are questionable, age of patients, different things like that. So, a lot of red flags, right? Okay, so next slide, please. Here's a couple of different versions of process mapping. You can go with pre-visit, visit, and post-visit, which is in your top left. And then you can even add swim lanes. And swim lanes show exactly what each role or department is doing for the process. So for this one shown on the slide, you have your front desk and all of the steps they take, your medical assistant, your nurse, and your provider. And it allows you to kind of just gauge what each person does and how, the different departments work together, and a pretty good overview of the process itself. All right, so that was a kind of a high level overview of process mapping. So now we want to talk about root cause analysis. Next slide. So for root cause analysis, we often get people who refer to it as gap analysis and kind of interchange those titles, which isn't quite the case. So for gap analysis, you're really looking for discrepancies or holes within the process. A lot of times it's used to compare existing state with like your target state. So you're currently doing this, you want to do this, what does it take to get there, and what's missing to get to that ideal or future state. It also generates a list of gaps or deficiencies that need to be addressed to achieve objectives. And it's used in strategic planning, performance improvement, and process optimization. A lot of times gap analysis can simply be reviewing the process map. It can be a series of conversations. It's not hard to pinpoint things that are just missing that would be ideal, or things that you would like to do. So or that should be done. So that's sort of what gap analysis is. Root cause analysis, on the other hand, is really trying to determine the underlying reasons for why something is happening. It investigates the causes of a problem to prevent a reoccurrence. And then it identifies root causes leading to the development of corrective actions. So this allows you to get to the most underlying reason why something is happening, so you can determine the best solutions to meet the problem. It's often used in quality control, problem solving, and incident investigation. Next slide. However, there are quite a few different tools that can be used for root cause analysis. 5 Whys, Fishbone, and the Pareto analysis are probably the most common that I've used. Failure mode and effects analysis is another one. But we want to hear from you. What are some of the root cause analysis methods that you've used? And I believe there's do we have an annotation feature? If not, go ahead and drop those in the chat. 5 Whys, Fishbone, yep, 2 of the most common.
Hey, Andrea, if anyone wants to annotate, if you see at the top, Christina Turpin's screen, if you press those 3 dots, you can go to annotate and do it that way as well.
Okay. Thank you. 5Y fishbone. Exactly. Yes. So not surprised there. Those are definitely some of the most common. Failure mode and effects really looks at like potential failures and how to address them. Pareto, it is one that I've used a few times. It's really based on the 80-20% rule that 80% of the problem is caused by 20% of the causes. So like if you're looking at your process map and you identify or there's a problem and you identify X number of things that could be contributing to that, and say you came up with a 10, 2 of them are probably, causing 80% of the problem you're seeing. So that's where Pareto is helpful in identifying which of those would be the best and most impactful to work on. Next slide. So the cause and effect diagram for root cause analysis, or commonly called the fishbone diagram, it's just a visual to allow you to identify and categorize various causes of the problem. Generally speaking, there are certain categories such as, like people, there's technology, let's see, processes, equipment, environment. So those would be your buckets. And then you would go through and you would talk about different things that fall under, say, people that could be contributing to the problem. And for HPV vaccinations, you may have, a line going to the left talking about patients and the issues there, and then one going to the right talking about providers. So maybe they lack education, or maybe they need additional support tools or things like that that could influence the people involved in the process causing the problem. But really, it's just to facilitate organized brainstorming sessions, keeping everything organized. And it kind of gives you that thorough insight on, what could be contributing to the problem so you can identify the best solutions for the problem. But when you are conducting a fishbone, there are a few discussion questions that you can, bring up to the group, like why do you think that's happening? What else is contributing to the problem? What categories are missing? How long has the problem existed? And what is the impact of the problem? So this is definitely something that you would want to complete with your team that's represented, throughout the process, so everyone can weigh in and, we can identify what is happening to cause the problem. Next slide. 5 whys. So 5 whys is such a simple, easy to use exercise. A lot of people are like, that seems so ridiculously simple, but it's really effective. And the whole point to 5 whys is to identify the actual root cause, not just a symptom of the root cause. So we want to identify, what's actually causing something to happen by asking a series of whys. Generally speaking, you can get to that root cause by the 5th why, sometimes 1 or 2 more or less. It's really easy to use. It focuses on the solution to identify, real solutions, for addressing the symptoms. It encourages deep thought, and an interesting fact, it was actually developed by Sakichi Toyota, who's the founder of Toyota Industries in the 1930s as part of their production system. So if you go to the next slide, it gives you an example. And this is such a, I've used this example over and over. You may have seen it before if you've went through a QI training, but it really does give you an idea of what that means. So you have a flat tire, you're parked in your garage, you have a flat tire, and you could just like stop at, the first Y because there's nails on the garage floor, fix the tire, clean up the nails. But that wouldn't necessarily get to the root cause of the problem. But once you really start thinking about it and looking into it, you realize that the box of nails on the shelf split open. Well, why did that happen? Because the box got wet. Well, why did that happen? Because there's a hole in the roof. And ultimately, this could have all been avoided if, the shingles on the roof had been repaired ahead of time. And so that is the root cause. And if you would have not got to that point, you would have fixed your tire and went on your way and could have had a whole series of new events happen or issues with the roof, with the shelf, with everything on the shelf. You could have had additional flat tires. So you're really avoiding any additional problems by fixing that root cause. Next slide. So, just to wrap up, there's a few things that, I want you to take away. Process mapping really gives you just a way to better understand your current state. It helps you visualize the process that you're wanting to work on. It can improve communication and improve training for new employees. It's really important to, identifying inefficiencies and or standardizing tasks to ensure consistency. This can come into play, especially when you have multiple sites and you want everyone to implement a standardized process. It's also, a great way to analyze current processes to identify gaps and develop a plan for achieving desired outcomes. On the other hand, we have root cause analysis. It's an in-depth problem identification technique. We can use the fishbone, we can use the 5 whys, depending on what the problem is. But it's really important to think deeper about something when you have an issue with your process. It creates effective solutions. So it's not just stopping at, the first issue you find and addressing it. It's really kind of getting to those underlying causes so you can effectively implement the right solutions. And then it's ongoing improvement, fostering continuous improvement by regularly analyzing processes will only help you continue to get better and better and better. And spoiler alert, doing all of this work also helps you with identifying your EBIs. And if you've ever worked with the American Cancer Society, it's all about the EBIs. So, they really sort of inform, what EBIs you can or should implement for your project moving forward. I think that's it.
Perfect.
Turn it over to Ashley.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Andrea, for sharing your knowledge and experience with process mapping and gap analysis. We're going to go ahead and skip today's question and answer and head right into the panel since you will be a part of that. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Gabby Darwell-Sanders, to introduce today's panel.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabby Darwell-Sanders. I serve as the Strategic Director for the Roundtable and one of the co-planners for this event, and I have the pleasure of introducing and moderating today's panel. And so we have a wonderful lineup. You've already met Andrea Anderson, Associate Director of Quality Improvement with the American Cancer Society. We're also joined today by Roxanne Kilmartin, who is the Quality Coordinator of Heritage Health. And lastly, but not least, Megan Mackey, who serves as Clinical Informatics and Grants Manager with Desert Sage. The slide just went away. So she's with Desert Sage health centers. And so we are so excited to have our three panelists join us today. And I will go ahead and just get started while I think we're trying to sort the panel setup here for your viewing. Andrea, phenomenal presentation. Enjoyed your discussion of all of the different processes and tools, the differences between the gap analysis, process mapping, root cause analysis, and gap processing. So I think you did a really good job of kind of clearly through describing some of your experiences. So I'm going to shift maybe some of the questions to some of our other panelists.
Sure.
So I'll start with Ms. Roxanne. Ms. Roxanne, can you share some of your experiences with process mapping and or gap analysis?
Yeah, thank you so much. So previously I did work for a health district as a health educator, and we did a lot of formal QI projects there that included process mapping and gap analysis. But when it came to heritage, I never really engaged in any formal QI. And that's not to say that we weren't doing it. It just might be that we have a project management team. So maybe I wasn't the appropriate stakeholder in some of the projects they were working on. So when we received the HPV grant last year, I was really excited to see part of our homework was this process mapping, because I got to actually coordinate it for our team. I think, like, what I would say kind of our process that we went through is, we developed our aim statement first, and then we really sat down, and Andrea kind of touched on this too. We wanted to make sure we identified our purpose. We really wanted that to guide our focus on when we were doing our process mapping for our current state. And then before we all got together, even though we had like this HPV work group, we wanted to make sure that when we did the process mapping, we had all the right stakeholders in the room. So even if maybe they weren't part of our regular work group, did we need to bring in additional representation from any of our teams to ensure the right information was being taken and the data was being tracked correctly? And then, this was, like I said, this was new to me. So I really took that simple, low-tech approach of sticky notes. And we used multiple colors and different shapes. So we had I put a legend down at the bottom. So I think we had red was providers, green was MA, stuff like that. And then we had circles, and then we used the squares and the diamond shape to kind of identify where those action steps were. And up at the top, I followed a lot of where that one that was shared where it said pre-visit, visit, and post-visit. I kind of had that to get us started. It was so cool because it was kind of this really organic process where I didn't know what to expect, but our team was super engaged. And I think we found out we had all the right people in the room. Some of the things that happened as we were doing it is we knew we were focused on current state, but of course we were getting excited about all these things we wanted to do. So we kind of had this wish list or these future things that we wanted to do. So we gathered those kind of in a separate area. And then after we were all finished, what I ended up doing is taking a photo of it and then putting that into a Visio so we could share that out a little easier with our teams.
Yeah. We love the organic. I'm a fan of stickies as well. If you come to my office, you'll see all kind of colors. So I think one of the things I want to follow up to that question before we shift to Megan is you talked a lot about the partners, right? And I have learned in our short time of engaging with each other that you guys serve very different population subgroups. And so was that taken into consideration in some of your planning and some of your process mapping during that process? Yeah.
Yeah. So, we had a very, I think if I'm understanding your question, we had a very clearly defined aim statement. We were focusing on initiation of vaccination of 9 to 11-year-olds. So I think that kind of set us up. So we knew that we needed to have representation from pediatric teams. And I think when we were doing it, one of the things we ran into is this probably unique to Heritage is that we had just brought on this new medical assistant training program. It's called Efficient Care. And so we had some clinics, we're a multi-site FQHC. So we had some clinics who were functioning under this Efficient Care model. So their workflows were completely different than maybe the ones that hadn't quite rolled that out yet. So we actually had to do multiple process maps to ensure that we were capturing the data for all of our different clinics.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you for that. Megan, so same question, and I'm happy to repeat it. Can you share some details about your process, the process mapping and gap analysis?
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is wonderful. At Desert State Health Centers, I feel like we love quality improvement and we live and breathe lean principles. So fortunately, this is really ingrained in people, and a lot of folks have the skills and knowledge to do this. They've done it before. And I will say, like, that helps the facilitation process go a little bit easier, but it's not rocket science. I think anyone can, step up to the plate and be a facilitator and join in the process. So for us, I would say we use process mapping really for anything. If it's a new process, we're trying to figure out what are all those steps and who's involved. But it's also a really great way for, like, if we're trying to improve something. Oftentimes, honestly, we don't have a process map that's been developed. And so for us to understand our current state, we have to put that on paper. And I feel like a lot of times we find out there's ultimately variation. And so Roxanne mentioned this and Andrea mentioned this, like, having your team of people is really important. So for sure, the people who are doing the actions and the steps in the process, like, they need to be at the table so they can say, this is what we do here. And after this step, this is what we do next. And you'll learn a lot about what is currently happening and how people might do things differently. And nobody's wrong, but it just gives clarity to the organization and the work group that's focused on that process. For tools, we use Post-its and butcher paper. We love our paper. I'm personally more of a technology person, so I always go back to my desk and end up putting it in Visio. We have Microsoft applications at our organization, and there is a free web-based version of Visio. So you don't have to pay for Visio if that's a tool that interests you. So that's a little bit about process mapping. Should I chatter on about gap analysis?
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and share, yeah.
Okay, I think similar to other folks that popped into the chat, we use fishbone diagrams and 5 whys, I would say most often. For fishbone diagrams, I would say in practicality, when we use it, if we're looking at a full process, we go through, like, observation and we identify waste. So if it's a defect that's happening in the process, variation, and we kind of add stickies to that process map. And then from there, we'll group, like, is it a manpower waste? Is it methods? Is it machine? And so then we categorize from there and build solutions off of that. Kind of like, maybe we have the most concerns around methods and we need to really look at our process more. And then 5 whys, I would say we typically use that if we're working on a specific outcome and we're tracking data and we're like, hey, like, why aren't we getting to where our goal or where we think we're going? And then you can ask the 5 whys from there. And I feel like data along with that is helpful because we can make assumptions, or one person might have a perspective. But I think for us, I'm a data nerd at our organization, like, that just helps you really dig deeper into the why.
Yeah.
So I will stop there.
Awesome. So our next question was really focused on tips and tricks. And I think that all 3 of you actually answered that question in your response to the previous question. But feel free to add any more tips and tricks. I know I've heard about sticky notes. I've heard about translation of sticky notes, an old school method to new school technology, engaging partners at various levels in all processes, and understanding that every individual does things differently. Thinking about all of the partners that are engaged in the process mapping and or any gap analysis that are happening, and just making sure that you're having increased dialogue, and then also mapping that out, right? And there's a variety of different tools that Andrea did a really good job of presenting to us that we can explore, even if you're new, a novice person to process mapping and gap analysis, some of which I'm like, oh, I can do the 5 whys. I don't know if I'm really comfortable just yet doing some of the other ones. And so one of our major questions that we want to ask is, how do you really address some of those key barriers and roadblocks? And this was a question that we had for you, but it's also a question that we just got in our chat. Like, how do you navigate some of those barriers, specifically for gap or root cause analysis? And for some of the examples they talk about is providing strong recommendation, declines in vaccination, or providers' recommendations not being where it needs to be, or unsure about the purpose or importance of the vaccine hesitancy. So how do you really, what tips or approaches do you have to really address some barriers and or roadblocks that may come up with the type of work that we do and how we use that to the work we do, or just the process overall? So either or. I'll go to Andrea.
Well, that's a great question. So I'll give you an example. We ended up going through, this is my only HPV project in my whole tenure with the American Cancer Society, and I've been waiting for this moment to share it. So I had an HPV project with an FQHC, and we went through process mapping, and then we went through, root cause analysis because they continue to have such a low completion rate. And when it came to identifying people, issues that could be in that people bucket, we start talking about providers and, provider education. We've had some new providers come on. Could it be a lack of, education or consistent education from provider to provider? We hadn't actually been tracking completion rates by provider. So, we started looking into it. And we didn't actually complete the 5Y, but we kept boiling it down and boiling it down until we realized that there were only a couple of providers that weren't actually performing well. And so we had to address them individually. And it turned out that one of the providers was actually using like their personal belief system to sort of influence like whether or not they promoted HPV vaccination at such an early rate or age. And that had to be, addressed by the system, by the medical director. And so, we had to use a couple of different techniques to kind of figure out, what was truly going on. But it all started with process mapping. Then we went to the root cause analysis, and then in a way, kind of used 5 Ys to boil it down to what was really going on and utilize leadership to help step in and fix some of that.
So is that also built in now that you've identified like these are some possible reasons why? Is that built into continual process mapping of how to overcome some of these?
Yeah, so well, we
common-
ended up going on to standardizing the process. And so that's just the expectation of the system overall. We had a few different sites that was part of that larger system. So everyone is now following the same process. It was standardized. We have an HPV vaccination policy. So, we had to do some work to really kind of get everyone on the same playing field, I think. And yeah, it continues to be something that they review. They have, their annual education for providers that they work into like meetings. So it's something that is continuously monitored now.
Awesome. So using the tools to help identify the pain points and then moving forward to standardizations of processes is what I heard, right? Thank you for that, Andrea. So I'll shift over to Megan, and that's just in the order that I see it. How have you addressed maybe some pain points or roadblocks that you have endured in either or both processes? And it can be just overall, or it can be relevant to HPV specific.
I'll share our example when we worked partnered with ACS on our HPV project. So we just in general had a very low HPV completion rate. And so we kind of really started with the 5 Ys. So why is that? And I mentioned I'm our data nerd. So befriend your data people, they'll help you. And so we looked at, well, how many of our patients have 0 doses versus 1 versus 2 in our target age category. And so we found out, well, there are some patients that are getting 1 dose or 2 doses, but the majority have 0 doses. And so then from there, we're like, well, why is that? And so we just did a sampling of patients and looked at like what are those appointment types, or are there certain like demographics about these patients? Like what can we learn from this? And ultimately we found out that the majority of those patients were seen through our what we call our car clinic or drive-through clinic. It's typically like an acute visit. And so our process is that we don't do vaccines through the car clinic. And so Roxanne mentioned, maybe different clinics have different processes. So like we did our process map and it was beautiful, but it was for all of our in-clinic patient appointments. And so we're like, if everyone follows this, like everyone's vaccinated. And so we realized like, okay, well, we really needed to like revisit what is our process during those car clinic visits, and what is our expectation? So, some folks adopt the belief, like, it doesn't matter what kind of appointment it is, like shots in arms, like, let's get those kiddos vaccinated. that wasn't necessarily our case, and that might also be true for your clinic. So we kind of shifted and did some outreach efforts of like, well, how do we get those, once those sick kids are feeling better, how do we get them back into the clinic? Have they had a well child check? Or we do sports physicals for our community. And so that's an opportunity where we also weren't doing vaccines. So I think just kind of asking some of those 5 whys, digging deeper, doing more process mapping. It's kind of this iterative process. It's not like one and done. You keep revisiting those tools and you can find areas to improve on.
Awesome. So we're getting a little short on time, so I'm going to shift this new question to Roxanne. More so focused on leadership, because I think the 3 of you guys did talk very clearly about how you get other staff engaged when there's changes to the process or standardization of the process. There's clear communication and kind of like a pivot or shift based on what you identify. But specifically, we're figuring out or wanting to know more about how do you share and receive feedback on your process map and or gap analysis with leadership? Like at what particular stage do you gain feedback or engage them with the process overall?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because, and the term buy-in is, so cliche,
Yes.
I feel like, but you do have to have that engagement and buy-in from your leadership to really it starts at the top, right? So what we do at Heritage, we do a few different things, and we kind of try to take a whole system approach, because we really look at like our culture, as everybody and not just leadership.
wanted to
The
show
leadership
you.
part is important.
Okay, this is the communication.
But I think one of the things we do that's really important is my pop health team that I'm a part of, my manager and I, we round with each department. So for like this project specifically, we round with our pediatrics team, which includes leadership and the pediatrics provider. And we share, like we talked a lot about data, right? So we share the data, but then we always go back to the basics. Let's look back at that workflow. Is this still right? Do we need to make some changes? Are there things that are supposed to be happening that's not happening? I did want to just kind of expand on the data thing too, because we did build a dashboard at Heritage that shows all the data by location, by provider, by sex at birth. So we really dug down into it to see, okay, is there specific areas that maybe we didn't capture in that process mapping? I mean, I think also like leadership, we get them engaged when we start talking about like we need to get some of our locations more standardized. We definitely want to look at those bottlenecks and increase those efficiencies. So another place we bring this information to is our quality committee. And we revisit it, I think, like usually on a quarterly basis. So we just really try to take advantage of every time we get those people in the room, we try to just get this in front of them, right? Because I think it can easily go to the back of the mind. People have so many competing priorities, but you have to just kind of keep driving it, and not to the point where it starts becoming like fatigue, right? But just like often enough, and in the right way where people are still hearing it and they're still thinking about it when they're making decisions.
Awesome, great wrap up. So, final few minutes, final recommendations from each of you, minute or less. So I'll start with Andrea. What should we know? What should we take? Final recommendation.
I think that for any QI project, it's important to have, leadership champion or, a provider champion sort of backing your work. So making sure you have that to sort of speak for you and push for you as you start your project.
Awesome. Megan, final wrap up.
Oh gosh, so much pressure. I would say, like, if you're doing process mapping or any quality improvement project, be really clear about what your trigger and what your endpoint is. When you're doing process mapping, like that can get out of control. You could do like Post-it notes all around your conference room for days. So be really clear and specific about what like process you're really wanting to dive into. And I think that will give you clarity and more success. And then you can grow from there.
Awesome. So clear guidelines, clear boundaries, clear focus. Roxanne.
I'm actually going to put a little plug in here for the American Cancer Society QI Toolkit, because I think it was super helpful. We actually showed the video to our work group on process mapping first to kind of set the stage. I just think there's a lot of really good tools there that you could use. So always maybe suggest referring back to that.
Awesome. So today we heard a wealth of information. Love the final wrap up. Have a leadership champion or provider champion. have very clear boundaries and set a focus or a goal, which your target is going to work towards, and then use some of the existing tools that are already out there, including ones created by ACS that are available to you and free, right? And that can support you. And I think one of the things that we also forget is it doesn't have to be a complex process. So use sticky notes if necessary, and then transition to one of the amazing tools that were discussed today. So I will turn it over now to Ashley, who's going to wrap us up for today's event.
Thank you so much, Gabby. And thank you, Roxanne, Andrea, and Megan for a robust panel. I mean, truly robust and information sharing. So thank you all for being a part of today's session and sharing your experience with us. So I am going to wrap up today's session and provide just some tools and resources to you if you want to go to the next slide. So we built an external website for all of our participants in the rural HPV vaccination learning community to be able to access all the resources we've shared during our 10-month journey. This includes recording and slide decks from our monthly sessions. So if you missed, June, where we talked about aim statements and action plans, you can access that recording and slide deck under important links. In fact, we've also pinned a few other documents for you. So program overview, registration link for this learning series, patient and parent-facing materials from both the American Cancer Society and the National HPV Vaccination Roundtable, and then also our resource roundup, which is where we host all of our tools and resources for you. And my colleague Akila has added a link into the chat. So if you haven't done so already, I highly recommend you, go to the website and bookmark it for future use. Next slide. So each month we've shared tools and resources during the sessions. So like I said, we've put together this really comprehensive resource roundup for all of you to explore and use. I think our quality improvement guidebook is on there already, but if not, I'll make sure to add it for this month. You'll see continuing education opportunities, data resources, quality improvement documents, and even materials around HPV vaccination at age 9. And we are regularly updating this document. So if you have a resource that you want to share with us, please send it to myself or Christina, and we will make sure to add it as well. And after last month's discussion on aim statements and action plans, you can see tools specifically around those two topics. And I'll also be adding tools for process mapping and gap analysis following this session. Next slide. So this is a resource to conduct in-person process mapping. I know all of us talked quite a bit about it. So all you really need is a large piece of paper, some sticky notes, pens and markers, things you probably already have in your office. And then you work with staff to put together what the process looks like to administer, HPV vaccinations to adolescents in your particular organization. And this will really help you visualize everyone who participates in that process and really identify gaps and opportunities. So we've laid it out for you so you can kind of see what it looks like. So you're not missing any parts if you were to do in-person process mapping. Next slide. I've also included a diagram to put together a fishbone with your partners. This could be done either in person or virtually, and this could easily be made, using a large poster and some sticky notes as well. Next slide. And additionally, if you are interested in doing a 5 whys, we've included this template for you to do so. And then next slide. I do want to call out some additional resources using a 5 whys template from IHI. If your staff are remote or work in different clinics, then maybe a virtual program will work better for you. So some of the programs, and I know Roxanne and Megan and Andrea talked about this, but there's Visio, there's Miro, or even Zoom whiteboard. So if you have access to Zoom, you can create a whiteboard just from any meeting, and you can use that to organize a process map as well. And the next slide. So now that we've talked about process mapping and gap analysis, I just was hoping we could do a quick poll so you can share with us, do you have a process map in place for providing HPV vaccinations in your clinic or organization? Have you put together 5 whys or fishbone around HPV vaccinations? And after learning about these tools, how do you plan to incorporate them into your clinic? So feel free to answer those. We'll give it a couple of seconds to do so, hoping we can get to at least 50%. 80 would be great. as we do the poll, do you want to go to the next slide, Tina? So this is just a schedule of all of our events. So we'll be having our next session on August 7th, and we'll hear from Dr. Stephanie Stars about evidence-based interventions. We did have to change the date and time due to a conference conflict. So everyone should have received a new invite with the updated time, the date and time. So if you didn't, please, let me know, myself or Tina, and we can get that over to you. Next slide. So as always, we want to end our calls with a call to action. So I encourage you to not only look at our website, and once again, Kayla, if you could link that in the chat, but please bookmark it for future use. Check out that resource roundup. It's got some really great tools for you. And as we prepare for our August session, I ask that you, really finalize your current state process map, organize an opportunity to do a root cause analysis with your quality improvement team, and from there start to identify some evidence-based interventions that can help make changes and improvements in your HPV vaccination rates. Next slide. We do have an opportunity for all of you, and I want to invite you to participate in our Rural Health Equity Partnership Survey to share your efforts and challenges in addressing cancer care needs of individuals residing in rural areas. So by completing the survey, you'll help to inform the American Cancer Society on how to best move forward in partnership with organizations like yours to reach rural communities and reduce rural cancer disparities. The time commitment is about 10 to 15 minutes. And we're hoping everyone can complete it by July 26th. So Kayla will put a link in the chat. And then next slide. As always, we want to hear from you. We want to hear what you liked and what could go better. Kayla has linked it a few times, just a link in the chat for our survey. That one's very quick and easy to do, but please, let us know what you want to learn in future sessions. If you're interested in being a part of a panel and sharing a best practice or a challenge, please let us know. We'd love to feature you because we really want to make this learning community a positive one and keep it relevant. So once again, thank you for joining today's call, and have a wonderful rest of your day. And we will see you in just a few weeks for our next session.